Okay, so yeah, the title of my paper is "Crossing the Path of the Man in Blue, Black French, and Police Violence." So this paper is, of course, about police violence against people of African descent in France. As we know, in France, like in many other countries, hopefully it's gonna. So in France, like in many other countries, the mission of the police is supposedly to serve and protect the citizens. But sometimes, okay. Can I try again? Okay. But sometimes, or even most of the time, the attitude of the police, the way in which the police are treating people of foreign extraction, as we say in the French context, is at odds with its own mission. In the past 15 years, and the Jefferson presentation has given us an idea about the level of police violence against people of African descent and Arab descent in France. The media have indeed reported scores of deaths and injuries among blacks and Arabs during their encounter with the police force. As a result of this violence, whole neighborhoods have become the theater of riots and degradation of public goods. Political authorities have been paying more attention to what is happening in the suburbs. President François Hollande made an unplanned visit to Aulnay-sous-Bois, which is a suburb in, not far from Paris, to assure the inhabitants of his government's unwavering dedication to justice. So what my research here is based on an extensive sociological and ethnographical studies that examine whether police intervention, both in urban and suburban areas, are motivated or are informed by race. Several scholars, including Deborah Ramirez, Suzanne Mesh-John, and Alice Goffman, have asked this question: do the racial and ethnic characteristics of the people using these spaces, that is, the suburbs, determine police decision on whether to intervene and also determine police action and modes of responses? However, as we can imagine, this research is so far primarily American and British. Only recently and marginally have French social scientists begun to pay heed to the role of race and ethnicity in the operation of the police force. And one of the most fascinating studies in this regard is by Didier Fassin, who just presented his work. This is a book published in 2011, an ethnography of daily routines of the famous Brigade Anticriminalité, which means anti-crime squad. Didier rode with this man in the Parisian suburbs, and he had a first-hand observation of the kind of practices that takes place among the police force. Another example of research on police is by Goris, Jobard, and Levy. This is a team of sociologists who did a research commissioned by the Soros Foundation. And during this research, what they did was it was a sort of ethnography and observation of three major train stations and the surroundings of these train stations in Paris: Gare de l'Est, Gare du Nord, and Châtelet-Les Halles. And they had filmed most of the interactions that took place at these three different areas, and for 7 months. And it came out of this research that, of course, there is a heavy police surveillance targeting people of color in these specific areas. So my presentation would build on mostly these two recent research by French scholars. And I wanted to ask new questions. And one of these questions is, how does such policing contribute to the ethno-racial compartmentalization of public space? Many studies have shown that in major cities in France, particularly in Paris and its surroundings, the ethno-racial diversity tends to lead to the emergence of housing niches disproportionately occupied by non-white people. And this includes, for instance, among these non-white people, Africans, of course, Caribbeans, Arabs, Asian, and Indo-Pakistanis, because there is a growing population of Indo-Pakistanis, I would say, in the last 20 years that you can notice quite clearly when you go to Paris. And this is creating a sort of a segregation or ghettoization that some scholars, such as Pretzel, would call a ghetto, a French or Parisian type of ghetto that is different from the American ghetto, because in his definition of the American ghetto, what characterizes the American ghetto is its almost exclusive black orientation, whereas in Paris, the ghetto, according to his analysis, is rather an area where you have a small presence of white people, but then the rest, the non-whites, are overwhelmingly represented and are concentrated in these areas. My second question concerned the modus operandi of police interaction with other races, in particular with the male black youth, because this is the group that is mainly targeted by the police. As an institution, the police force is not an island. Its members are not immune to the common opinions and prejudice of their society. Ralph Miliband and Nikos Poulantzas, already 30 years ago, had characterized the police as one of the state apparatuses, that is, an apparatus serving the interests of the higher class and at the expense of the lower class. So ideally, the police should be politically and socially colorblind, but sadly, this is rarely the case. So the level of violence that police perceive to be necessary in dealing with situation usually changes according to the demographic against which it is used. I make two arguments here. The first one is that police violence is essentially an instrument for preserving the social order in a way that is decipherable to those who benefit from it. So specific categories of citizens are contained only in certain areas, and their use of other areas are extremely regulated and restricted sometimes. My second argument is that the power to enforce such arbitrary division of the space is legitimized by unfavorable representation of the disfranchised groups, that is, this marginalized group. This representation derived from political discourses, educational institutions, journalistic narratives, and also popular culture. For instance, one of the main representations of Black and Arab youth is a group of people characterized by a macho culture, by violence, and by homophobia. So these are three major characterizations of people of African descent and Arabs. Now, in order to talk about police violence against people of color in France, there is one caveat that we have to address. As we know, race does not exist in France. There is no census about race. So as a result, the sociologist is faced with a real problem, which is how are we going to characterize, racially speaking, these people? The interesting part is that we can circumvent this problem by looking or resorting to some metaphors. And space is one of the metaphors for race in the French context. When Black people, for instance, talk about themselves, they have no problem using some of these denotative terms such as black, nègre, etc. But when non-Black people talk about Black people, The terms that are used are most of the time connotative of race, and it could be banlieue, cité, et cetera, et cetera. Banlieue, usually we translate by suburbs, but it is not, in my view, a appropriate translation of the word suburb, because the suburb in the United States, as we know, is an area characterized by a certain wealth and, a model of, family model, et cetera, that is, middle class and so and so. But in the case of France, the banlieues are the impoverished sectors of the society. And the cités are most of the time, some district of segments of these impoverished parts of France. So we are going to look at these metaphors of race, such as banlieue and the cité, in order to understand what the police is doing and to what extent we can say that by targeting the banlieue on the cité, the police are also targeting blacks and Arabs or other minorities. In France, there is an evolving model of social organization, which means that race and ethnicity work both to divide the physical space, and they act as criteria for access to them. Abdelmalek Sayad's research, for instance, several years ago had illustrated that as migrants increasingly came to dominate public housing projects, the white working class occupants deserted these suburbs and moved to no other neighborhood. Agnes Van Zanten has documented how parents develop strategies that consist of pulling out their children out of schools that are reputed for their low academic achievement and their high concentration of minorities, and then move them to other schools. Bourdieu also, of course, has shown us mostly how through the school system, which in his view is simply catering for a specific social class, this social class managed to weed out children of low extractions, and then eventually the schools become pretty much a system in which we find mostly kids of higher or middle class. But Bourdieu and many French sociologists did not account for race in their analysis. But his concept of school as an instrument of the state is a valuable tool for understanding the similar concept of the police as predominantly white body of civil servant. The police are indeed an instrument for enforcing the ever-growing race-based division of France's spatial spaces. To quote Tim Cresswell, the police activities essentially determine what and who belongs where, and what and who is out of place. So the pervasiveness of this idea is that black presence should be confined to specific areas, and this should contribute to feelings of suspicion when they are seen outside of these spaces. So white spaces, black anxiety, that's one of the subheadings. Do the police function as enforcers of race-based division of French public space, or not? We can look now quite clearly at the statistics that are provided by Jobard and his team. As I said, during their research on these three different train stations, they noticed 37,833 individuals were involved in those specific spaces. And they broke down this number by showing that 57.9% of the people seen on these specific train stations were white, 23% were black, 11% Arab, 4% Asian, and 3% Indo-Pakistanese. And among these people, 525 were stopped by the police. And this is how this number, 525, breaks down. 141, that is 26.8 white, 201, that is 38.2 black. So what these statistics show is that although non-whites statistically were far less present in these three train stations, they were massively overrepresented in the encounters with the police force. Only one white person out of 155 was stopped by the police, but one black person out of 43 was stopped by the police at this train station. Another datum that I had to analyze is a documentary made by Renaud Levent Kim. The title is Dans la peau d'un noir, which means black like me. And the filmmaker used a hidden camera and followed a group of 4 men riding in a car through Paris and the suburbs. One of these men is actually not black, but the filmmaker used makeup in order to turn him into a black man. So these 3 men, for 2 hours, were followed by Renaud Levent Kim riding through Paris and other neighborhoods. In 3 hours, they were stopped 3 times. And now I'm just going to account for the interaction they had with the police. The first time they were stopped, this happened in the city of Levallois-Perret, which is, just slided in the outskirts of Paris, about 5 minutes by subway from Paris. And the police officers told the car occupant that they had been stopped because one of their lights was not on. And after carefully checking the vehicle, the officers handed them back the papers and say, "Don't steal French cars, rather steal German cars." And the man responded, "Oh, we're not robbers, we didn't steal anything." 20 minutes later, still in Levallois-Perret, they were stopped for the second time and asked, "What are you doing here?" The officers seemed to be looking for a pretext. They asked the driver, "Do you have a spare wheel in your trunk?" And the driver said, "Yes, I have a spare wheel in my trunk," which is, by the way, not a question that the police ask people, because, I mean, it's not a police business. There's no rule, no law saying that you should ask a driver if he or she has a spare wheel. So the driver said, "Yes, we have one." And then the policeman asked the driver to hand him the document. He went back to the car, to the police car to do his background check and come back and say, "Oh, gentlemen, you'll have to come with us." And the driver said, "Oh, really, why?" "Well, this car apparently is a stolen vehicle." And the driver said, "Oh, no, we didn't say." And then the policeman said, "Oh, I was just joking, actually. Have a good evening." They left. And then about an hour later, this time in another neighborhood that is not identified in the movie, but when you look at the scene, you know that it's also a quite affluent neighborhood, they were stopped for the 3rd time. And this is a squad of what we call the CRS, Compagnie Républicaine Sécurité, and they asked the drivers, "Okay, what are you doing here?" And the driver said, "This is a mid-November, mild weather. We're just trying to enjoy the weather like anybody." So they spent about 50 minutes with the driver, looking everywhere in the car, and at some point, just out of nowhere, they asked him, "Do you use drugs?" And they responded, "No, we don't use drugs." Now, I wanted to share with you another case, which is more personal. When I was much younger, like many undergrad students, I had to do some menial jobs to make ends meet. And one of these jobs was to be a child caregiver. Every single day, 4 days in a week, I used to leave my school, go to Issy-les-Moulineaux, which is also another middle-class neighborhood, pick up a group of 4 kids, siblings, same mom, same dad, children of very, successful people, because the mom was a dentist and the father was a civil engineer. So I took them home, I made sure that they did their homework, and then after that we played soccer for the rest of the evening between 3:30 and 7 when the parents came back. And one day during the week, which was always a Wednesday, I had to take one of them to his badminton practice. And one of these days, it was in the spring, I was walking down the street Diderot, coming from the school, and we were walking to the badminton practice. And all of a sudden, a police car cut the sidewalk, and then we had to stop. One of the policemen leaped out of the car, pushed me against the wall, and said, "Don't move." And the boy 8 years old, green eyes, blonde hair, panic and start crying. And the second officer went to him and said, and tried to comfort. I was not able to see them because I had my head against the wall. So then the second cop eventually came and asked the cop who had who pushed me against the wall, okay, so let him go. And then he turned me around and said, okay, do you have an ID? I said, yes. I showed him my ID. He looked at it, handed me back to me, said, okay, it was a false alert. Have a good afternoon. So we left. And of course, I mean, like many people, I was in such a state, and I didn't want this little boy to see the state in which we were. And when we went home at 7, he told the story because I didn't want to tell the story to the parents. So he's the one who told the story to the parents. So what I wanted to do here is to share with you to what extent the three experiences are related. What we see here is that we have, of course, in each case, group of black males. But there's also one thing that is very important, it is pace. And what characterizes the different spaces, that is the railroad that I mentioned, Issy-les-Moulineaux, but also Levallois-Perret, is that in the case of Issy-les-Moulineaux and Levallois-Perret, we have middle-class neighborhood. The average income is 3,700 euros, which is in the French context per month, which is in a European context quite high. So the identity of Issy and Levallois-Perret is then straightforwardly clear. Now, when we look at Châtelet-Léal and Gare du Nord, Gare de l'Est, this is a different story because these are public spaces. And public spaces that are theoretically designed for commuters. But we know also that with the advance of capitalism, there are so many places in the world, I mean, mostly rail train stations, that have been turned also into sort of a, socializing space where you have tons of cinemas, nice restaurants, sometimes also middle-range restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. So these are places that are no longer being used only by commuters, but by, many other people who can afford to go to these movies, theater, and to these eateries. And in the case of Gare de l'Est and Gare du Nord, the interesting part is that Gare de l'Est and Gare du Nord, for a certain part, as a result of the making of the European Union, have become also the face of Paris. Because you can take a train directly from whatever country in Europe and arrive directly to Gare du Nord. So, and in the mind of the people traveling, and also in the as framed by some French politician who said that French is Christian and white, such as Nadine Morino, a stranger or a foreigner who arrives in Paris in Gare du Nord should expect to see France. And if the representation of Frenchness is whiteness and and Christian identity, as a result, the situation there becomes that people who are using this space must look exactly like the representation of the space. And the police becomes, therefore, an instrument to enforce this view of France, that is of Gare du Nord, Gare de l'Est, and Châtelet as, spaces that are white and belong to white people. I have to skip a lot of things because I don't have time anymore. I just want to jump directly to my second argument when I was saying that the way in which the police is dealing with people of African descent and Arabs in particular is something that is informed by the representation of the people of African descent and Arabs in France. Recently, we have seen a wave of discourses and practices premised on the idea that people living in the suburbs and the city are violent, are homophobic, and are driven by a macho culture. I want to take a few movies. If you take the movie titled Entre les Murs, which is translated by The Class, or if you take the movie, a very recent movie titled Gang de Filles, which is, girls' gang, For the first time, by the way, in the history of French cinematography, we've seen a movie with mainly black young black adults, having leading roles, etc. And the portrayal is extremely negative because in this movie, what you see is a group of young black girls who don't like school, are not interested in school, and they live in an environment that is, permitted by violence, and themselves actually exercise this violence against other girls. In the class, the quite interesting thing is that it is a multicultural cast, and in this movie, the blacks are the one having the most negative roles. Suleiman, for instance, who treats his high school student as a faggot, you say, and you have also Carl, who said, okay, well, everything I like about life is just drinking alcohol and going with girls, etc., etc. So then, this homophobic representation of people of African descent and Arabs, as I say, explained to a certain extent now some practices by the police. Rape was unknown. And the case of Theo is quite interesting because, as DJ Fassan just mentioned before me, by deliberately, sliding his button in the anus of this boy, what the police was trying to highlight is the fact that you become demasculinized. And as an homophobic person, the worst humiliation maybe that you could do against someone who is, who has some prejudice against homosexuals is by demasculinizing these people. So sorry that I did not pay too much attention to the time, but thank you for your, I don't want to take more time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping the time to the assigned 30 minutes. So the next speaker on this panel is Professor Deborah Thompson. She's a professor of political science at the University of Oregon.
Yeah, great.
And again, thank you in advance for keeping within the time so I don't have to use my yellow paper.
No problem, I'll try. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me. I'm here to talk about Canada, which is not a country you necessarily will associate with state violence against Afro-descended populations, but I am going to prove that it should be. So in the summer of 2016, Black Lives Matter Toronto staged a protest in the middle of the Gay Pride Parade, and criticism was swift and vehement. The Globe and Mail columnist Margaret Wente, who's like a Canadian Ann Coulter, opinion said that Black Lives Matter Toronto is not needed because, quote, of the obvious fact that Toronto is one of the most racially peaceable cities in all of North America. We're not Ferguson or anything like it. By pretending that Toronto is just another racist hellhole where police routinely gun down Black kids, Black Lives Matter do not create a useful forum of discussion, nor do they pay attention to the Black kids who are gunned down by other Black kids. Don't those lives matter too? She concludes by condemning Black Lives Matter Toronto as, quote, the new bully on the block, a tiny group of noisy activists who borrow their branding and belligerence from the United States. The president of the Toronto Police Union agreed with this assessment and said that police brutality, quote, is an issue for Black Lives Matter in the United States. To say we have the same issue in Canada, I just totally reject that idea. The numbers don't back it up. The culture doesn't back it up. So what I want to do today is make an argument that's very similar to what Professor Smith argued yesterday in regards to Brazil, which is that the condemnations of Black Lives Matter Toronto is indicative of some key facets of ideas about race in Canada. First, that racism existed a long time ago. And second, that racism exists somewhere else, primarily in the United States. In a lot of ways, the very fact that Black Lives Matter exists in Canada is very uncomfortable for a lot of Canadians. So in my other work, I'm interested in the state's management and manipulation of racial classification schemes. And so this work, it dovetails quite nicely because these are all ways in which the state attempts to manage, surveil, and control racial populations. So just to give you a brief overview of Black people in Canada, there are three waves of Black immigration that we need to kind of contend with. The first are who we call the Loyalists, and they are the Black people that either fought for Great Britain during the American Revolution and were given their freedom and told to come to Canada, or those slaves that the British brought with them when they were expelled from the United States after losing the American Revolution. Slavery existed in Canada until 1833, when it was abolished throughout the entire British Empire. The second wave of Black immigration, we call the refugees. And those are the people who escaped slavery in America, largely after 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Act was put into place. They escaped slavery through the Underground Railroad and came to Canada and settled in southwestern Ontario. This is where my father's family is from. Now, the majority of the Blacks who came to Canada through the Underground Railroad, in fact, left Canada after the end of the Civil War, because like all refugees, what they ultimately wanted to do was go back home. And the most recent wave of immigration to Black Canada happened after 1967. Canada had a white-only immigration policy until essentially 1962. In 1967, it opened up its immigration policy and used a race-neutral point system to enable immigration to the country. And so the new wave of immigrants are largely from the Caribbean and the countries of Africa, but the population is still really small. So according to the most recent census, Black people in Canada tally just under 1 million people, which is about 3% of the population. But even though there's this very small population, there's a clear pattern of the devaluation of Black life in Canada. And that manifests through immigration and criminal justice paradigms, through unequal access to housing, overrepresentation in child welfare systems, and the incarceration system. And while these challenges aren't necessarily unique to Canada, what is kind of unique is that Canadians refuse to recognize the reality of the situation. So why do we have these limits to what I call the temporal and spatial imaginary of Canada? First of all, the dominant cleavage in Canada has always been the French-English cleavage. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, the language of race was in fact used, sometimes I would say felicitously, to describe the conflict between the dominant English group and the minority Francophone population, which we call the Québécois. And at times, even though there's interesting colorblind politics in Quebec that aren't unlike those we see in France, at times the Québécois have adopted the language of race to refer to their own struggles, I think kind of problematically. One of the most famous examples is Pierre Valeret, who wrote a book in the 60s called The White Niggers of North America, where he compares the exploitation of French Canadians to the exploitation of African Americans in the South. Second, the myth of the mosaic. So the idea that Canada is a mosaic, always contrasted with the melting pot of the United States, it means that Canadian identity has always been formulated against American identity. So in a lot of ways, being Canadian is being not American. And so if racism exists in the United States, it can't possibly exist in Canada because we are not American. And third, the contemporary multicultural discourse, which is this important facet of Canadian identity, and the acknowledgement that if racism did exist in Canada, it would really run counter to the ways in which Canadians view themselves and the country. So in these ways, Canada, I think, speaks to Anne-Laura Stoller's conception of colonial aphasia, which is a dismembering, a difficulty speaking, a difficulty generating a vocabulary that associates appropriate words and concepts with appropriate things. Aphasia in its many forms describes a difficulty retrieving both conceptual and lexical vocabularies, and most importantly, a difficulty comprehending what is spoken. right? So in this way, Canada is actually a really useful case to think about the contours of global racial formations and the ways that anti-Black racism permeates national boundaries precisely because of this inability to talk about race. So I'm interested in particular in issues of time and space, right? The relationship between temporality and territoriality, and the ways that we can think through global white supremacy and how transnational racial projects are kind of global in origin and formulation, but maybe domestic in application. So to think about the long shadow cast by slavery and the ways that we still live in the afterlife of slavery, I'm thinking here about Saidiya Hartman's work and Christina Sharp's work. From Saidiya Hartman, we need to consider whether the identification forged at the site of suffering confirms Black humanity at the peril of reinforcing racist assumptions of the limited sentience, in that the humanity of the enslaved and the violence of the institution can only be brought into view by extreme examples of incineration and dismemberment, or by placing white bodies at risk. What does it mean that the violence of slavery or the pained existence of the enslaved, if discernible, is only so in the most heinous and grotesque examples and not in the quotidian routines of slavery? So this, as well as Christina Sharp's work in the Wake, kind of speak to this challenge of how do we think about the shadows and lasting effects of slavery in a country that denies slavery ever really happened. And in terms of the spatial shadows, we have to think about the long shadow, especially in the Anglophone West, that's cast by the United States, and the ways that American race relations are used as a shield in other places to deny the existence of racism. So I argue that we need to think about race itself as something transnational. So the trans and transnational denotes moving through space or across lines, as well as a changing nature of something. Besides suggesting new relations between nation states and capital, transnationality also alludes to the transversal, the transactional, the translational, and the transgressive aspects of contemporary behavior and imagination that are incited, enabled, and regulated by the changing logics of states and capitalism. So transnationality in this context would manifest through coloniality and colonialism, through the concept of diaspora, and through the acknowledgement that there are global racial formations that we need to come to terms with. It doesn't mean that domestic racial projects don't matter, but rather we need to think about the interaction between the transnational and the domestic realms and the way that the concept of race and the materiality of racism changes in these interactions. So the task at hand, I think, is to reconsider Blackness in Canada and in order to illuminate practices of state domination without reproducing the kinds of comparisons that render it invisible. And I think a way forward is to think through time and space, right? The shadows that fall and layer kind of unevenly. So similar again to Professor Smith when she talked about Sekela. In other work, I'm very interested in like ghosts and zombies and duppies. But in terms of rethinking through time, I think we need to rethink about the power of past narratives, especially who gets to speak and formulate these dominant narratives, the ontological meaning of post, right? What does it mean that we're in the post-civil rights era, the post-racial era, the post-colonial era? And third, the nature of racial time, which is work by one Michael Hanchard, that disrupts the formidable seduction of the liberal idea of progress. And in rethinking space, I would argue that we need to pay heed to what Richard Eiton called a reflexive Black politics, a new way of thinking about global colonial formations instead of just civil rights, and to rethink diaspora as aniform, right? Not just discourses of resistance, but also the way that refusals and resurgences can account for cross-racial solidarities and transnational activism. Okay, so the empirical stuff. How does state violence manifest in the Canadian context? A number of ways that are not dissimilar from what we've heard already so far today. One is persistent economic inequality. So Black unemployment in Canada is about 73% higher than white unemployment in Canada. Black women earn 88 cents of the earnings of white women, 79 cents of the earnings of Black men, and 57 cents compared to the earnings of white men. There's underrepresentation of Black people in all democratic institutions, including legislatures, the judiciary, and also the bureaucracy. There's never been a person of color on the Supreme Court of Canada, and of the 100 judges appointed by Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2014, 98 were white. There's overrepresentation in federal and provincial prisons. The Black population of Canada is about 3% of the Canadian population, but it's 10% of the incarcerated population. These statistics are even more concerning for Aboriginal populations, who are 4% of the Canadian population and 25% of the incarcerated population. So the odds of being Black and incarcerated in one's lifetime are greater in Canada than they are in the United States. But nobody is talking about this issue in Canada. Black Canadians have lower educational attainment, face discrimination in housing and employment. Black children are overrepresented in the foster care system. 2/3 of Black children in Canada live in poverty. And there's a higher sentiment of not belonging to the country. In Canada, we call this the problem of the second generation, right? Those children of immigrants who are still continually asked, where are you from? No, where are you really from? A brief history of talking about racial bias in policing in Canada. The same types of discourses that surround Blackness and criminality in the United States are present in Canada. But remember, Canada's very, very white until like the 1990s. According to the 1981 census, the country's 96% white. So we don't see the emergence of what Canadians call a visible minority population until the mid-80s and early 90s. But in response to some police shootings in the 1980s, a task force on race relations in policing brought the Special Investigations Unit into existence. And this is a unit that's civilian-led, that oversees all deaths and assaults perpetrated by police. Now, how effective this unit is questionable. There were 300 cases that the unit investigated in 2016 that resulted in 20 charges against police officers. So we see some similar circumstances that compared to the United States. In 1992, there were riots on Yonge Street, which is a main street in Toronto. It's spurred partly by the Rodney King decision in the United States, but also because 3 days earlier, police shot and killed a 22-year-old Black man named Raymond Lawrence. These riots or uprisings led to the Stephen Lewis report on race relations in 1992, which offered a series of recommendations on how to address the systemic discrimination in criminal law, law enforcement, and education systems. In 1995, the report of the Commission on Systemic Racism in the Ontario Criminal Justice System found that there was systemic racism in the Ontario Criminal Justice System, and made a number of recommendations on how to rectify the situation. What happened with all of these recommendations and these task force? Nothing. Shortly after 1995, the government changed hands from the NDP, which is Canada's Socialist Party, to the New Conservative Party, and all the recommendations were essentially tabled, as well as some other items like the Conservative government withdrew, it abolished the Employment Equity Act. Now, it's important to note here that a lot of the information we have about racial bias in policing actually come from the press, right? So in 2002, the Toronto Star created a series called Singled Out, where they examined whether or not there was racial profiling on behalf of the Toronto Police. And the answer is yes, absolutely there was. And in 2010, the Toronto Star analyzed contact cards, which I'll talk about in a second, by the police that have been filled out by the police, and found that there was gross overrepresentation in arrest, detention, and incarceration of Black people in Canada. So now if I can just talk about this issue of carding in Toronto, which has been in the press lately. So what is carding? It was a policy that was implemented in the mid-90s that allows officers to stop, question, and document members of the population, even when no offense has been committed, and even when they're not even suspected of having committed an offense. So police don't file cards for every interaction, but they only file these contact cards when they want to document an interaction for intelligence gathering purposes. These cards contain a person's details, your name, your race, your location, who you're with, and then all these details are entered into a database, and the information is kept forever. and is not easily accessed by the public. And again, these are people who were not arrested, who were not charged, who were literally just stopped on the street for being on the street. Now, the proportion of cards issued for Black youth are about 3 times greater than the share of Black people in Toronto. In fact, one analysis demonstrates that the sheer number of cards that exist for young Black people in Toronto is greater than the number of young Black people in Toronto, which means that even people who were like visiting Toronto and Black probably got pulled over by the police. Now, the Toronto police deny that the policy is either racial profiling or stop and frisk. According to Toronto spokesman Mark Pagash, it's a different legal system with different legal tradition in a different country. We do not engage in stop and frisk. But actually, if we compare the numbers of Toronto to New York stop and frisk, like I said, it's 3 times greater in Toronto compared to Blacks' share of the population, whereas stop and frisk is only 2.3% greater, right? So we have a bigger problem, really, in Toronto. Now, there have been a lot of attention given to carding, in part because of this article that was published by journalist Desmond Cole, who has been called the Canadian Ta-Nehisi Coates. Questionable, but regardless. So there's been this recent public outcry over carding, in part because of Cole's article. It also coincided with the emergence of Black Lives Matter. And so there's been a back and forth over a few years about revising the policy, including this interesting situation in which the Toronto Police Board proposes a policy change and the police chief refuses to implement it. But in 2017, in part because the province passed regulations that contained rights-based requirements for these types of policies, the 2017 policy put in place requirements such as officers must inform people of the right not to answer or not to identify themselves. Officers can't approach people just because they're part of a racialized group, which you would think probably should have been part of earlier policies. Police must provide people with a reason they are stopped, which cannot be arbitrary, and those stopped will receive receipts that detail the encounter, including the officer's name, badge number, and details about how to make a complaint. And access of the database now requires permission of the police chief, and who accesses the database will be tracked and reported to the police board. Important to note that police can still stop you for any reason as long as it's arbitrary, but if they want to fill out this contact card, they have to abide by these regulations. I had this interesting conversation, no, I'm okay. I have this interesting conversation with my brother, who's a Crown attorney, or what will be called a district attorney in the United States, and we were talking about carding, and his point was that, look, police are gonna do what police are gonna do, right? State power is state power. So he would rather see them have to fill out information every time they stop Black people as a way of checking their power, right? And the idea that the fact that police have to fill out this card would be some kind of deterrent from them just stopping people arbitrarily. But police can still stop people, right? They use the card for surveillance, management, control, and for intelligence gathering. But the police are still stopping people and not filling out cards. So we actually don't know what those numbers are. So why do we have this situation in Canada? I think a couple of reasons. One is the mythological status of the police in Canada. Everyone remembers Dudley Do-Right, the Mountie. And the police are this narrative of the police as the good guys is really powerful in the country. Secondly, and I think importantly, this dominant narrative that there is no racism in Canada. And that what policing does is police keep us safe in bad neighborhoods. So there have been a number of responses by police officials. The Toronto Police Association said in 2002, quote, "No racial profiling has ever been conducted by the Toronto Police Service." The chief of police in 2002 said, quote, "We do not do racial profiling. There is no racism. We do not look at nor do we consider race or any of that as factors of how we dispose of cases or individuals or how we treat individuals." The mayor in 2002 said, quote, "I do not believe the Toronto police engage in any racial profiling in any way, shape, or form." In 2010, the police chief said, quote, We look at it as neighborhoods because that's where crime is taking place. There's a whole bunch of reasons, and race is not one of them. But we know from the Toronto Star analysis of carding that Black people were actually more likely to be stopped when they were in white neighborhoods than they were to be stopped when they were in their own predominantly Black neighborhoods, which itself was still a pretty high rate of stopping and filling out these contact cards. Activists, for their part, want the database destroyed. But legal experts argue that it can't be because there's a number of civil suits that people are suing the police for illegal stops, and we need that information to continue through with these lawsuits. Moreover, the current chief of police has said, quote, "If we can have access to that information, it can potentially save lives. If this information can save lives, I think that it's important to think about." Okay. Third, Canadians, so the Canadian national motto is peace, order, and good government, as opposed to America's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it kind of speaks to these different political cultures in the two countries. Canadians tend to be more deferential to authority. They tend to trust the government more. That's why we have healthcare and Americans don't, one of the reasons. And new work by Alison Harrell demonstrates that Canadians are more likely than Americans to think the police should be able to record telephone calls and emails without a warrant, to search property without a warrant, to stop and detain people of a different race if they are thought more likely to commit a crime, to ban the Muslim headscarf in public, which has just happened in Quebec, and to monitor what happens in mosques. Also, there's a lack of and problematization of of racial data. So there's always been pushback in Canada about the collection of racial data, not unlike France, but Canada actually does collect data in its census. Canadians are still really uncomfortable with this, though. They're generally uncomfortable with the language of race. Though police departments in the major cities, including Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Edmonton, Vancouver, collect racial data from civilian interactions, they don't make these data available to the public. In fact, the Toronto Star series had incredible difficulty obtaining the data that it used for these analyses of carding, and only were able to access data after a court intervened. So we actually don't know in Canada how racist the criminal justice system is because police departments won't release their data so we can do the analyses. So we don't have good data on stops, searches, arrests, detentions, or police brutality. Finally, I want to make a key point that anti-Black racism in Canada still occurs within the context of settler colonialism, where the Canadian state has violently dispossessed Indigenous peoples. And so now in Canada, there's some new political will towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, but it's important to understand that Indigenous peoples have often borne the brunt of state violence, sometimes simultaneously with Black people, sometimes they're a particular kind of specific kind of state violence that pertains only to Indigenous people. On average, Indigenous populations fare far worse than Black people along most socioeconomic indicators. And I think while there's a lot of work to be done in Canada to combat anti-Black racism, I think we also need to come to terms with Black people's roles as settlers and the ways that our communities permit and perpetuate colonial violence against other people of color. So to conclude briefly, race has been integral to Canada's nation-building and colonial projects, and racial ideologies were critical to the emergence of Canada as a white settler society. Canadian racial politics have always been concerned with the regulation of non-white bodies in the country and informal mechanisms that kept non-white bodies out of the country for a really long time. So if we reconsider space, we might explore the ways that transnationalism highlights the significance of different national experiences of the same global phenomenon of white supremacy, and acknowledge that resistance to white supremacy has always found strength in global numbers, and that, disturbingly, American racial exceptionalism is actually not all that exceptional. If we reconsider time, maybe we should think through the ways that contemporary criminal justice enables the management and surveillance of racialized population, but we don't even know the extent of this domination because we don't have data to prove it. That the separation of the past and the present is actually itself a racial formation that works to foreclose the tendrils of history, and the ways in which our conceptualization of post-racialism becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when we imagine race in particular ways. And I think that above all, the Canadian case demonstrates that, like, if the police racially profile blacks in Canada, and if the racial state is still willing to and works to manage and surveil and control black populations in a country known for multiculturalism, then there's clearly something transnational happening. There's clearly something about anti-black racism that exists in excess of national boundaries. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your papers. Actually, very much in keeping with the. I have this. This is with the theme of this conference, addressing in a comparative way the transnational dimension of global racial dynamics and identities today. I think both, what I will do is I will respond briefly to both your talks. I will offer some comments and questions, and then I'll let you respond. So actually my comments and questions are for both of you. What I hear in Professor Guy's talk, but also in yours, Deborah Thompson, is this recurring preoccupation with exceptionalism and American exceptionalism. On the one hand, it sounds like there is a way in which we can offer a discourse on global racial identity while not being preoccupied with America, but at the same time, America is the reference point historically to be able to claim that there is no racial problem in our particular country. So we hear that in Canada, you mentioned, there's no racism in Canada as a almost foundational myth. And in France, we heard also that today with the presentation of Didier Fassin, this Republican myth that race does not exist in the Republic. We heard that recently with François Hollande saying there is no place for race in the Republic. But it seems like the only way to assert this is by pointing back to the United States and saying, look at what Americans do, and look at where the kind of horizon of American politics and social life, to say we're not there and there is no risk for our populations because we're not Americans. I also hear in both your talk that one of the issues basically, and that's also from my perspective, which is more literary and cultural study, is that this is very much about myths. It's very much about, of course, national narratives, but it's also about challenging some of the myths that run through the quotidian, French quotidian, but also the Canadian one, in what you explore, Deborah. I very much appreciated your presentation. It is about myth, but it seems to me that it's also about language, and I hear in this kind of wavering of terms about race in Canada something very similar in France. And if I could just stop a minute to recall a case just a year ago, actually, in France, where there was something similar to an Amber Alert, which came from the Ministry of Justice. And in the first version of the Amber Alert, the person was described as a person of the black race. And then immediately social media reacted and said, there's no race, so how can you use the word race? Then a few hours later, they changed the statement to say a person of black skin, with black skin, personne de couleur noire. And by the end of the day, they had changed a third time to say, we're actually looking for a person of black color, right? So it's like this undecidability or hesitation with the semantics of race that I'm also very much interested in, and I think it's interesting to see it circulate globally. And finally, a question which is, I mean, these were just comments, but I have a question for both of you about perhaps another perspective, which would be coming from those marginalized groups and their ability to change society through resistance. You have not mentioned, and I know that you know about them because I've read your papers. I was wondering if you talk a little bit more about the way that civil society has organized to resist violence, to change laws, to make sure that these quotidians that you described are actually more livable on a very daily basis. So I'm basically asking you if you could shift the perspective a little bit and tell us what has happened since the 90s, because we're talking about the same time frame here. So you could basically take 6 minutes each to respond, and I would appreciate that.
Sure.
Yeah. Is that?
Yeah. So I think those are great comments, and it's a great question. So one of the interesting puzzles in Canada, I'm going to say before the emergence of Black Lives Matter, has been why what we call visible minority, why racialized populations haven't risen up to challenge the structures of domination. And I think here I'm kind of reminded of the work of political scientist, I think, Anthony Marx. He wrote a book called Making Race a Nation about, compared the United States, Brazil, and South Africa. And his argument's quite complicated, but one of the things he talks about is that because legal segregation and these formalized systems of segregation and domination and inequality exist in the United States, that inadvertently spurred like the movements that then were able to challenge and dismantle them, right? So we have a civil rights movement in part because we have Jim Crow segregation. And in Brazil, he argues, because there was never any formal system, people who work on Brazil, correct me if I'm wrong, formal system of segregation in the same way, that stymied the development of these civil society movements that could then challenge like these clear forms of inequality. And Canada is kind of similar to Brazil in that way, right? There's never any castle to smash. And if people would acknowledge the castle to smash, they would probably write it off as not really existing anyway, right? So in a lot of ways, like the fact that racial minorities in Canada do have these lower socioeconomic outcomes, they are incarcerated at higher, well, Black people are incarcerated at higher rates, and yet there's no public discourse, is one of like the great mysteries that hopefully social scientific research will one day try to tackle. But what marginalized groups have organized, though, it's just always been on a much smaller scale and always less effective, I think, in some ways than in the US, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that in a parliamentary system of government, you can lobby all you want, but if it's a majority government situation, they don't have to do what you say, right? Like lobbies are much less effective in the Canadian context. The second reason is that visible minority populations have always been fairly small until quite recently. Like the Black population is 3%, It's small, it's concentrated in cities which themselves are very far away from one another. But that being said, I think Black Lives Matter Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal have been successful lately at bringing their message to the fore, and at times have been punished for it, like not just by the police, but by the public at large. Like when Black Lives Matter stopped the gay pride parade and demanded that the police no longer be allowed to participate, like there's always a police float at the gay pride parade, even though gay pride started because of police brutality. And Black Lives Matter said, no, like this is not, it's not safe for us. You're making it not safe for Black people to want to participate in this event by enabling the police to participate as well. And my God, the backlash against that was absurd. It was, Black Lives Matter has been villainized and called every name in the book. They've been called racists, right? Like Black Lives Matter, like they're the real racists, right? Not the police that beat, detain, stop, search Black people every day for no reason. Anyway, so that's a long, rambly answer that like Black people have mobilized, they have resisted, but man, it's an uphill battle.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for these comments. I was wondering if we could take 5, 6,
Yeah,
7 minutes.
okay. All right, I will try to not speak for more than 6 minutes. Yeah, actually, this is something that I'm grappling with right now, that is to see the level, if there is a correlation clearly between the visibility of this issue that is, police violence against Black and minorities in the French context, and the visibility of the movement created by people of African descent. Just to take an example, in October 2005, we had one of the most famous riots in the Parisian suburbs as a result of the death of three teenagers. One was of African descent, one was of Maghrebi descent, and one was of Turkish descent. So this took place in October 2005. And end of November 2005 was founded the very first association called itself Representative Council for Black Association. This is the first time in the history of France that an association was created and used the word Black. So there is again, as I say, there is a correlation to maybe try to make here in order to see to what extent people of African descent have contributed to making this topic visible. And before 2005, in 1998, a group of activists of African descent created a sort of a network. It was not really a formal association named Collectif Égalité. And this is an association that targeted representation of Black people on TV by saying, first of all, there is a dearth of Black presence, and we are going to sue the French state because we pay taxes and we don't see Black faces on television. The second thing that we want, they said, is that whenever you decide to write script or whatever about the history of people of African descent, we want to be the one writing them. Because, of course, as we know, there could be a representation of people of African descent on television without giving them, a more balanced role to play, because, it's most of the time a negative distribution, representation of people of African descent. And now, with regard to violence per se, the CRAN, which is this famous National Association, Representative Council for Black Association, is one of the organizations that has sued the French government as a result of the death of Amadou, Amadou Coulibaly, if my memory is correct. This is a young man, 24 years old, chased by the police. He went to his apartment and trying to hide, and 3 policemen came on him, kneeling down on his body, and he died as a result of asphyxia. And it's the gendarme instead of police trying to explain that, well, this was just an accident and he was ill and so. And even the prosecutor in the beginning was saying that, okay, it's not, as a result of police action, because this guy was just in a physical state that explained his death. And then this verdict was ruled out by another forensic expert who said that no, there is a clear link between the action of the police and Crown now is one of the group that have that are suing the French state. So this is the role pretty much that black associations are trying to play nowadays with regard to this issue.